I'm Mr. Ramsey, saving Western civilization, one student at a time.
In this episode, we're discussing fascist Italy and how it relates to the Second World War. We're just doing the background, though. So, if you remember, Italy was actually on the Allied side of the war, just like Russia or the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union, of course, dropped out. Italy was also on the Allies before fascist Italy became, under Mussolini El Duce, a totalitarian state. Now, the word fascist comes from the word fasces, which is a Roman term, means bundle of rods. It showed the Roman consul's symbol of power, that he had the right to discipline the citizens of Rome through rods, or by an axe, by cutting the head off. Okay, so that's what the fascist is. Okay, and matter of fact, the man that's in charge of fascist Italy is this guy named Benito Mussolini, and his motto was believe, obey, and fight. And he set up a single party in Italy when he took control of Italy to establish this totalitarian state. And that political party was the Fascist Party. And the Fascist Party was against individualism. It emphasized nationalism. Matter of fact, it's a kind of an aggressive form of nationalism. He glorified the state, and it's under a socialistic model. There's a discrepancy in these days where some people would argue that fascism was on the right and communism was on the left, and I would actually argue they're both leftist ideologies. They're both totalitarians, because most people on the right are not going to be for totalitarian or authoritarian regimes. But we can have that discussion later. Anyway, in the 1920s, before Mussolini took over Italy, the Italians had lost over 1 million men in war. Okay, and they had a bad economy, they had agricultural depression, and the socialists in the legislative body of Italy were making gains. Peasants were seizing land from the landowners, the farmers, and tenant farmers were refusing to pay the rent. So it looked like there was going to be a communist-style revolution in Italy. So, in March of 1919, Mussolini formed his organization, the Black Shirts, okay? And from 1919 to 1922, the Black Shirts and the communists, which they'd call Reds, waged street warfare against each other. And I think it's very important to know that Benito Mussolini, who's in charge of the Fascist Party, was actually, before he was a fascist, he was a prominent socialist. So I think there's a tie between fascism and socialism, because they're of the same ideas. One's more nationalistic than the other. Communism is international socialism. Fascism is national socialism. That's how I distinguish the two. One's just for Italians, and supposedly in the Soviet Union it's supposed to be for all workers, which really was not the case. But we don't have to play the semantics here. Anyway, so from 1919 to 1922, you had street warfare between the Reds, the communists, and the fascists, the Black Shirts. And to try to seize control, in October 1922, Mussolini does his famous March on Rome, where Victor Emmanuel III, who was the king of Rome, gave Mussolini power. And by 1924, Mussolini had consolidated that power, and the fascists had gained control of the Italian parliament. And once they gained control, Mussolini suspended the Italian constitution, and he became dictator, which he called himself El Duce, the leader. By 1926, he outlawed all political parties, all political opposition. He set up state schools, which were basically indoctrination, education. He censored the press, radio, film, and everything was for the glorification of the state. And by 1925, he signs a Lateral Treaty, the Fourth Lateral Treaty, recognizing Roman Catholicism as the official religion. Okay? And he and his party controlled the economy. That's what a socialistic system is controlling the economy. What is produced, how it's produced, and for whom it's produced. Okay? And his Italian industry was organized into 22 guilds under the Council of Corporations, which is under government control. And he turned his country into a corporate state where you had syndicates and you had corporations of workers and employees that formed in each industry that the Italians worked in. Okay? And these syndicates would have representation in the legislative body. And they made policy on wage, production, and distribution. Okay? So it was the Italian government who told what it could produce, how it could produce, and for whom it could be produced for. And that is really the definition of socialism. Okay? So fascism, I would argue, is actually a nationalistic type of socialism. And that's why I'd put it on the left. I do the same thing with the Nazi Party, and we'll talk about the Nazi Party in just a second. Well, not just a second, just I need to go with some background. We're switching gears from Italy to Germany. So I need to go background before I talk about Adolf Hitler and his rise. Germany is a little different than Italy or Russia because Germany was actually one of the Central Powers that was defeated in World War I. And in early 1919, they had to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which blamed them for the war, which made them pay retribution to the Allies. So Germany has to set up they all three set up different types of governments. But Germany, after the war, sets up a democratic state known as the Weimar Republic, run by the socialists. And the Weimar Republic lasted from 1919 to 1933. And they're the ones that actually signed the treaty. And lots of Germans blame the Weimar Republic for signing the Treaty of Versailles. Okay? And the Weimar Republic becomes unstable because in the street fighting, just like in Italy, you have nationalist groups fighting communist groups. And so they have a hard time actually suppressing these types of groups, the violence in the streets. And matter of fact, it doesn't help that the German government had to pay $35 billion to the British and the French. And when the Germans couldn't pay that, in 1923, the French actually marched into Germany, into the Ruhr Valley, and took control of the coal mines and steel mills, and to make sure they paid with actual minerals and German resources. So, to meet this demand, Germany in the 1920s started printing more money, which caused inflation, which actually comes to hyperinflation. So before the war, 4 German marks equaled an American dollar. By late 1923, it took 4 trillion marks to equal a dollar. And the matter, there's horror stories during this hyperinflation where a person would get paid and they'd put the money in a wheelbarrow, and then when the guy went to go to the shop to pay for bread, he'd come in and ask how much the bread would cost, and he'd come back and someone had dumped the money and taken his wheelbarrow. That's how hyperinflation was. It was bad in Germany. And this is the reason why people turned to extremist groups like the Nazi socialist group, or the National Socialists, which we call the Nazis. Okay? So the actual term for the Nazi Party is the Nationalist, or the National Socialist German Worker Party, or the Nazi Party. And a lot of people say, well, they're not really socialist. No, they're socialists because the government decides what is produced, how it's produced, and for whom it's produced. Okay? And Adolf Hitler is going to rise. He's the 55th member of the Nazi Party. He actually went in. He was working for the government. He was actually spying on the National Socialist German Worker Party. And then he actually became a member, the 55th member. And then he became the leader because he was an articulate speaker. And so he actually models himself by following the example of Benito Mussolini. And his people, his stormtroopers, or his street thugs, if you will, are not black shirts, but brown shirts. So his is the brown shirts. Okay, and in 1923, during this whole crisis, he actually tries to overthrow the government, and he starts off in Munich, and it's called the Bierhofputsch, which means rebellion or overthrow. And the putsch was failed, and Hitler was then sentenced to prison, and that's where he writes his book Mein Kampf, which is My Struggle. And Mein Kampf, in that book, he lays out his plan for Germany. He talks about what he wants to do, what the German Social Worker Party was supposed to do, the National German Social Worker Party. Okay? And in his view, the Germans were not responsible for losing the war. It was the Jews. It was the communists who stabbed Germany in the back. Okay? And he said, we need to get rid of these people from our country to make a pure master race, an Aryan race. Okay? So after his release from prison, Hitler resumed his activities in the early 1930s, and the Nazi Party started to win seats in the German legislative body known as the Reichstag. Okay? And he actually ran for president against Ludendorff, and he lost. But he was named chancellor in 1933. And his goal the entire time was to make Germany a totalitarian state. So, but the Nazis in the early 30s was a minority until you had the fire in the Reichstag, which is the German parliamentary building, in February of 1933. And once that fire happens, Hitler blames, as chancellor, the communists, and he asks for emergency powers, and he does not give those emergency powers up until he loses the Second World War in 1945. So from 1933 to 1945, Germany is going to be under Hitler's rule. Okay, as Chancellor of Germany in 1935, he passes the Nuremberg Laws, which strips Jews of their citizenship and the right to hold public office. Then in 1938, November 9th and 10th, you have the Night of Kristallnacht, which is the Night of Broken Glass, where members of the Nazi Party attacked Jews on the streets. They destroyed Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues. And Hitler's secret police, known as the Gestapo, run by Heinrich Himmler, arrested Jews and other opponents of the Nazi regime by the thousands, and many were put into concentration camps. Now, just like Stalin does in the 1930s, Hitler also eliminates people in his own party. On June 30th of 1934, you have this thing called the Night of the Long Knives, because he and his brown shirts are seen as a threat to the military, the German military. And the German military says, you need to get rid of the brown shirts. And so what he does is have his SS eliminate the brown shirts. And that's known as the Night of Long Knives, where on June 30th, 1934. And once he does that, the military comes in step. His friend Ernest Röhm is the guy that's in charge of the SA, or the brown shirts, and he turns against him because he needs the military backing. Once he has absolute power, he calls himself Der Führer, the leader. And he calls himself the Third Reich, or the Third Empire. The first being the Holy Roman Empire under the Habsburgs, The second being the Second Reich under Otto von Bismarck and the Kaiser. Okay? And he argued that his Third Reich, his Third Empire, would last for 1,000 years. Okay? And once he takes power, he is going to ignore the provisions of the Versailles Treaty and start rearming Germany, which is going to lead to the Second World War. We'll talk about that the next time in our lecture. Hope you enjoyed.